In today's episode of Heart of Poland, we'll speak to journalist and best-selling author Adam Zamoyski, one of the foremost writers in the English language about Poland, a person whose life in so many respects reflects that of Poland in the 20th century and indeed beyond. We'll hear the fascinating story of the lives of his parents when they came to the United Kingdom, and indeed his reflections on Poland, Polish history, and the way that Poles talk and reflect on their difficult and troubled past. Adam, thank you very much for joining us today, and as a reader of some of your many books, I have to say it's a personal privilege to have you in the chair today. The Zamoyski name is one with great meaning in Poland. Your family has a long lineage in Poland. Can we start maybe by talking about that? Who was your father, and indeed who was your mother?
Well, my father was, before the war, he was a Polish farmer and a reserve officer, but he encapsulates so much of what happened to, particularly to his sort of milieu, the people who were the landowners. He was born before the First World War in Russian Poland, and actually briefly wore the Tsar's uniform as a cadet in St. Petersburg. But somehow my grandmother managed to get him shipped out to England in 1916. On a very perilous boat journey, and he went to school in England and stayed there throughout the war. But then he came back to Poland and did his military service and went to the Jagiellonian University in Kraków and got his doctorate, and then farmed his land. And it's absolutely typical, because the house he inherited in what's now southeast Poland, was totally demolished during the First World War. And he spent his whole time rebuilding it, and every bit of profit of the estate went into restoring the house. And they moved in Easter 1939, and of course it was blitzed in the Second World War. But anyway, there you go. And he had a very distinguished war record. He was a ADC to General Sikorski, and was
Polish commander-in-chief.
Yeah, and he was the go-between between Sikorski and Churchill, because of course my father knew English perfectly and knew all these people because he'd spent so much time in England. And he did his staff course, and he fought. He fought at Narvik. He fought in the fall of France. He then fought with the 1st Polish Armoured Division. So he had quite a what's known as a good war, but landed up as an émigré in England. But he did at the end of the war also, because he was such an expert, he was given the chance of recovering all the horses, the bloodstock the Germans had looted from various countries, from France, from southeastern Europe, from the Hungarian and Romanian studs, and of course all the Polish studs, Jan of Podlaski and so on. And he brought all those horses back to Poland in the late 40s.
And your mother was also a countess, I believe.
Well, no, actually she was a princess. She was born at Czartoryska.
Slightly underestimated.
But she was born, of course, in the Western German-occupied part of Poland before the First World War. And so she, they had a mixed experience of that.
And where did they meet each other?
In Poland, and they married in Poland before the war. And
before the war.
They had me very late, so they were almost, 2 world wars and 2 generations away from me, and 2 revolutions actually.
You described your childhood as being or belonging rather more in the 19th century than in the 20th century as a result of that.
Yes, I mean, I really feel like I just sort of belong on another planet, really, at times.
Well, you're on this one for now. I wonder, it's often said that the people of that generation, that Polish generation, were particularly patriotic, that they particularly cared about bringing their children up in the what was seen as traditional patriotic Polish tradition of resistance, expressed through cultural forms, songs, poems, activities. Did you have that kind of childhood?
Well, yes and no, because actually my parents, partly because my father's, a huge pool of English friends, and also my mother, who had a French grandmother, had a huge pool of relatives all over Europe. And so we used to, we didn't sort of live in Polish London, in South Kensington, yes, and then Chiswick and all that. And so I didn't join the Polish Boy Scouts. I did briefly go to Polish Saturday school and I was brought up, my mother reading Sienkiewicz to me and so on. And we were certainly brought up in a very patriotic way, but not quite as sort of regimented as a lot of the others. It was an easier thing. And funny enough, I think it helped me because I know quite a few of my contemporaries brought up in London with Polish parents, and they felt they were being brought up in a ghetto. They felt they were, and a lot of them just felt they had to break out and rebelled against it. Whereas ours was much more. It was more relaxed, and it was as though our Polishness was not something special and hidden, a kind of faith that one had to worship. It was a natural part of the European heritage. And as a result, I think it's helped me enormously to, when I write about Polish subjects and about Polish history, because, so many people who write about Polish history, whether they're Poles or whether they're foreigners, I mean, look at Norman Davies, they get tremendously sentimental and emotional about the whole thing. And, they're either sort of fighting the Polish corner or they're saying the Poles are frightful, useless anti-Semites or whatever. Whereas I'm quite dispassionate about these things. They're just part of the great European jigsaw, and at times they did quite well, at times they didn't do so well. Like everybody else, every nation has its detestable aspects and its charming ones. And I think that's why people always tell me that I've written the only readable history of Poland, because it's not trying to fly any flags or apologize or boast. So that was a help. But also, the moment I could, in my first summer vac from Oxford, I decided, well, I'm just going to have a look at this place. And so I got on a train, and this was 1968, and my God, the train journey was quite a grim thing.
Yes.
Going through East Germany with all these frightful border guards looking like extras from a film about Nazis, with their, Alsatians, sniffing every bit of you, and their machine guns, and then I saw. Again, I found I had a wonderful time in Poland, even though living conditions were unbelievable, and one was followed, and one was very much aware of the brutality and the fear. And yet, Polish society was. What was so marvelous in those days was that if you met one writer or musician or actor or just fairly educated person, within a couple of weeks you met the entire cultural elite of Poland. And so as a teenager, I met, Wajdan, Zanussi, and most of the actors of that time, and most of the, the Konvickis and the things, and And it was extraordinary because you just became part of a gang, and you'd arrive and they'd say, oh, right, and this evening we're all going off to so-and-so's. And that was incredible privilege. You know. It was.
And did your parents ever go back to Poland?
No, they didn't. They felt, well, my father died before communism ended. And in a sense, the emigres had always said, you know, they'll only go back in uniform. And I always think it's so nice because my father died in the 70s, and I gave all his uniforms to the Zamoyski Institute in London because they're quite historic. But for some reason, there was a very elegant dress jacket of his that I kept, a khaki one, but it was very elegantly cut, in London in 1940. And I'd kept that, and it somehow didn't seem to fit me. But it fits my wife, and every time, and she wears it to go riding, and every time she canters across the Polish countryside in that, I always think that my father must be looking down and thinking, right, you know, my uniform's returned. So that's.
Let's move on to your journalistic career and your career as an author. What took you on that direction, on that path?
Well, I was always interested in history, and you know, when I was at prep school, I was interested in British history because that's what one was taught. But I found that more and more what annoyed me was the fact that even when Anglo-Saxon historians or French historians were writing about Europe, that Europe always ended on the Elbe. And I felt this disconnect very strongly, and I thought this is ridiculous. I'd like to find out why there is this break, you know, how it happened. And for me, every book I write is always written out of curiosity to discover, to sort out for myself what happened. Because, you know, we all have some idea about some event. And you think you know about what happened at the Battle of Waterloo. But the minute you start researching it, you suddenly realize you know nothing. And actually, you begin to realize that most of the people whose books you're reading also don't know that much either. So I found that particularly writing the history of Poland, was for me a way of, you know, laying out all the facts one could get, the hard facts, looking at the sort of cultural aspects of it, and looking at the literature and, you know, the mindsets of the people, in order to actually discover what on earth was going on and who were these people and what did they think they were doing. And that's always the most interesting part of writing a book. I mean, I've just now published a biography of Napoleon, which again, you know, there are thousands of biographies of Napoleon, and I've read quite a few, and they've always left me wondering, well, who was this guy? And to me, it was a source of immense satisfaction to be able to just reading what he wrote and his letters, and just getting to looking at the first-hand sources, and realizing, trying to work out who he thought he was and what on earth he thought he was doing. So that's what draws me to history, is a quest for curiosity, really.
There can be few battles which I think best evidence the fact that history seems to stop before it gets to Poland. The Battle of Warsaw in 1920, one of the subjects that you covered in your books about Poland. I wonder, how much do you think the onus is on Poland to fix this problem? In other words, to somehow bring these enormous, great, certainly European-wide battles of European significance to the wider world's attention?
It's a very difficult subject, trying to trying to spread knowledge about Poland around. And what most Poles don't seem to understand, and I tried to explain this at a conference in the presidential palace hosted by President Duda a couple of years ago, I tried to explain that, nobody likes bad news. When you ask me, you meet me in the street and you say, "Hi, how are you?" And I start saying, "Well, I've got chilblains and I've got a bit of arthritis in my leg and actually I've got a headache." You don't really want to hear that and you lose interest. Whereas if I tell you, "Well, actually, I've just done this and I've done that," and so you're interested. And I can tell you about the arthritis and the chilblains later. And so rather than dwelling on the fact that more Poles were slaughtered in the Second World War than anybody else, and that we suffered more and more things, which immediately make people feel uneasy, one should actually start with the positive things, with the things that are at least interesting and fun. And then you can bring on the other stuff. And by then, people will listen to the sad story because they already sympathize with, as it were, the hero of the story, the main character. Whereas if you just sort of, you see a tramp in the street lying there, in his vomit, you're not going to say this man's story is very interesting and get a lot of people interested. But, if you start telling the story of a bright young man who marries a beautiful girl and then she gets killed in a car crash or she dies of cancer and he goes downhill and takes to drugs or something, and then you go on to that, you can begin to bring them in. It's a very simple, it's normal in a way.
But okay, so I imagine that at that conference, probably everybody agreed with what you said.
No.
No?
No. There was the general feeling of, no, we must tell them about how awful the Warsaw Uprising was. No, we must tell them about the martyrology.
So do you think that somehow, the past has been just so painful that it's not possible?
Well, I think the problem is, and it's all, everything is always understandable, and this is the first role of a historian, is to try and understand, however ghastly somebody is, or people are, you have to try and understand what Stalin was up to, what Hitler was up to, rather than just saying they're so frightful, forget it. What happened to this society in this country was absolutely unspeakable. And it went on happening in various ways. And after 1989, before 1989, lots of things were not spoken about, were not allowed to be spoken. Then after 89, it was possible to start the archaeology of the past. And for all sorts of reasons, which are completely understandable, the then elites, the then dominant elites, which included most of the ruling parties, but also most of the opinion-forming journalists and writers, were not so much had been brought up not in sympathy with the horrors of what had been going on. And their attitude was, come on, we're joining the real world, let's look to the future and let's go ahead. And a great number of people in this country, possibly the majority of the population, felt, hang on, well, we're free now, but somehow we're not, we haven't got down to the dirty washing which should be washed. There is some kind of a reckoning to be made of some sort, or a coming to terms with things. And this was rather sort of pushed aside as being, morbid and so on. And so suddenly there's been a great reaction in the last 10 years or so, and everybody wants to read about the most frightful things, and all the conspiracy theories have come out and so on. And so there's this tremendous, and it's gone over to the other extreme, which is again very unhealthy, because there's a lot of wallowing in the misery, which is which is not good. And also a lot of it is exaggerated and it's too simplistic. And again, people are being painted as heroes and martyrs when, they were just people.
We're recording this episode in a week in which it would be fair to say that Polish-Israeli relations have not been good, with comments from various sides around the actions of certain Polish individuals and groups during the Second World War. Do you think this is the epitome of what you've just described, the inability to sort of look at some of the less pleasant and more unfortunate aspects of the Second World War?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a huge problem. There's, what's been going on this last week, I think, is largely politicians trying to grandstand each other and pose as defenders of their respective nations, both in Israel and in Poland. And it's incredibly silly and immature and regrettable. Generally speaking, the problem is, it's a huge problem because it's a human relationship gone wrong. In most countries, there wasn't anything you could possibly define as a relationship. If there was a Jewish community, very often there wasn't a community. There were Jews around the place, and yes, there was anti-Semitism everywhere, but it wasn't an issue. Now, in Poland, there was this huge community, and there was a Jewish community, and there was the Polish nation, and there was a relationship between the two, which lasted 800 years. And that relationship was blown apart with the partitions, because in each of the partitions, a third element came into it, i.e. the new power. And both sides felt betrayed by the other. And, it's a bit like when a love affair goes wrong. There can never be or a marriage breaks up, there can never be an easy divorce or a dispassionate divorce. There are terrible blame games. And in this case, it's okay, the metaphor may be a bit stark, but that is what has happened, is that, two communities that lived together for, centuries, and, okay, it wasn't always rosy, but it was not too bad. And frankly, it was amazing that they lived so harmoniously together for so long, given what happened in every other country. And then it all got blown apart. And what happened in these lands between really in the 1930s and the 1950s, not to mention then the communist, the next decades, was so frightful, so dehumanizing, so morally discombobulating, and people lost their moral compasses there on both sides, and people in every community behaved, some unbelievably badly and some unbelievably heroically. And to wade into this and start blaming people or accusing people is pointless and ahistorical and just idiotic. But once somebody says, some Pole did something awful, then other Poles will say, well, the Jews did something awful here, but we did this, and so on. And, it's just very sad.
There seems to be very much a sensation, or from the Polish side, if people only knew the other good things that the Poles did, which have been so dampened by the fact that there was a communist overall.
Yes. And of course, what is monstrous, and really nobody should make these comments, it's like people talking about concentration camps or anything. Any serious survivor of a concentration camp will always say, you cannot judge. If you were ever in that position, the dehumanizing nature of the surroundings, you can never, ever judge what people did. In order to survive, in order to get a bit of bread, in order to or just suddenly you were so dehumanized, so demoralized, you thought, well, the whole world's gone mad. Well, why shouldn't I make some money by denouncing a Jew if I'm, the whole world's been turned upside down, morality's been turned upside down. And after all, there were also Jews handing in Jews, as well, because their moral system, they said, where is God, One shouldn't judge, one should, people like us who are fortunate, and everybody who's fortunate enough not to have lived through those things, should never, ever, ever point fingers at anybody.
In closing, Adam, Poland is a country full of undiscovered stories yet to be found, even about the people who are known, but also the people who aren't. I wonder, is there any period of Polish history that you think still has a lot to offer historians and indeed the general reader?
Yes, I love the whole slightly benighted period of the First Republic from the middle of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, because although it was a sort of political and social experiment that ended in tears, it was a time in which the Poles really sort of, it was like party time. If you look at the architecture of the times, the art of the times, the social history of the times is fascinating. It became such an extraordinary amalgam of East and West, and extraordinary cultural mixtures and ideological and also racial mixtures going on. The nobility contained Muslims and Jews and Protestants and Catholics, and this in a Europe which was becoming much more conformist and state-ridden. And here were all these people kind of trying to create a sort of riotous, mad republic in which everybody was theoretically equal. Of course they weren't, but to me it's a very exciting period, and much more interesting than is generally represented. Because in the 19th century it was very much swept aside as being, it was the time when we made mistakes, and it led to the downfall of Poland. But I think for today it's much more attractive attitude of rejection of the state, and the whole idea that as little government as you can have is a good thing, and so I like that period.
Adam Zamoyski, thank you very much for being on The Heart of Poland. You can find Adam Zamoyski and his enormous collection of work, journalism and books. I can call it a love affair, I think, with France and Napoleon and the Napoleonic era, but also his many books on Poland, which I heartily recommend. Your book Poland actually made #2 on my favourite books about Poland.
Well, it is the only history of Poland that's ever been on the bestseller list,
And therein
quite an achievement.
It is. And you did a revised edition, didn't you? Yes, so there you go. So you can find Adam online, and don't forget to share The Heart of Poland wherever you find it, be it Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, or any of the other social media platforms that seem to sprout, as Polish say, jak się po deszczu. We'll see you next time on Heart of Poland.